Welcome to The Tech Life with Rich Conte, bringing you stories from the front lines of the tech industry and the insider's perspective on starting, growing, or thriving in a technology venture.
Welcome to another episode of Silicon Harbor Radio, brought to you by the Tech Life podcast and Silicon Harbor Magazine. I'm your host, Rich Conte. Each episode, we take you inside Charleston's rapidly growing tech and startup community and give a voice to the local entrepreneurs and other contributors driving that growth. Innovation is a word that's virtually inescapable in the technology industry. It is inherently a focus of tech startups, as their success hinges on new technologies or new ways of applying technology to establish position in a market or create new markets. However, larger and more established companies face a different set of challenges when it comes to innovation. Primarily, how to sustain or sometimes reinvigorate their ability to innovate as they scale in order to maintain their market position. On this podcast, we spend a lot of time talking with local entrepreneurs about how their startup ventures are seeking to innovate. But Charleston is also home to a couple of large established technology companies that are facing the challenge of continued innovation. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with a product management leader at Blackbaud about his experience driving innovation within a larger organization with an established portfolio of products. Our guest on this episode of Silicon Harbor Radio, brought to you by the Tech Life podcast and Silicon Harbor Magazine, is Steve MacLaughlin. Steve, in addition to being a best-selling author and thought leader, is Vice President for Data and Analytics at Blackbaud. And full disclosure, most of you know I work at Blackbaud as part of my full-time gig, and Steve is the second Blackbaud guest I've had on, and I'm really honored to have him here because working with him on a day-to-day basis is one of my favorite things about being at Blackbaud. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks for having me on the show, Rich.
Steve, for our listeners that aren't already familiar with Blackbaud, can you share your take on the company's mission and customers?
Sure. Blackbaud is the leading provider of cloud software to the nonprofit and philanthropic community. We work with about 35,000 organizations in over 60 countries, and we only really serve this part of the sector. We're not in the commercial world or anything else, and present some interesting challenges.
Tell us a little bit about your role and how your background led you to product development.
Well, my background should mean that I have no business doing what I do for a living. I come from more of the design, human interaction, UX side of the world, but I've dealt with data for quite a long time, especially in the digital space. And a few years ago, I really saw this as an emerging area relative to some other things, and really developed an interest in trying to understand more about data analytics, AI, machine learning, and how we could apply that to problem solving. I think it's partly because there was a good portion of my career in the corporate sector where I dealt with consulting and implementation, and then I dealt with product management, and now I'm dealing with product management plus analytics and data, that I have a bit of experience around. It's one thing to solve customer problems from a consulting perspective, and it's one thing to solve customer problems by building better software. I feel like I'm in this third rev here of trying to use data and analytics to solve customer problems at scale, which is very different than a one-to-one or one-to-many approach than maybe what I've done in the past.
The story of the large established market leader experiencing challenge with sustaining innovation and facing the threat of disruption from smaller, more nimble, emerging competitors is a pretty universal one. Why is this challenge almost inevitable for technology companies that experience success?
Yeah, this whole issue of disruption, innovation, anyone's ever read The Innovator's Dilemma, anything by Clayton Christensen, any of that type of milieu of book leads you to realizing that for a lot of companies, it's an inevitability that if you achieve some modicum of success, the problem then you run into is the problem that success breeds, right? A diverse customer base, changes in technology, and then you ultimately, I think, sometimes get into these problems of what's called the consumption gap. So you build very rich, full-featured products, and then oftentimes you get disrupted in the market by products that do less, but maybe they do it better. And you contend with the fact that, any tool from Microsoft Word to anything else It has lots of features, but users tend to use a very small percentage of the overall feature set. So you get to this consumption gap. You have way more stuff that the tool can do than any one individual user could ever really consume. And that opens up an opportunity for disruption in the market. Also opens up opportunity to innovate. I'm sort of a believer in disrupt yourself before someone else disrupts you. And sometimes it's a challenge because really what you're disrupting is the status quo, or in some cases you're disrupting, hey, this has been really successful. Why would we mess with this formula? And I think it's just realizing eventually all things come full circle, and if you don't disrupt yourself, someone will take a crack at doing it to you.
From an organizational perspective, how much of it is a people problem versus a culture problem or a process problem or a strategy problem?
It's a great question. I think Peter Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's true. Although it's become a little bit too convenient lately to say everything is culture. Maybe that's overused, but certainly culture is about the habits, the attitudes, the practices. Culture is what happens, when people are just walking around doing stuff. You can certainly develop bad habits. You can certainly be blind to certain things that are happening, and that can get ingrained in a culture. I think the other thing that's worth noting is, there's innovation and there's innovation, right? There's sustaining innovation, which is, the continual incremental improvement that you're doing. And that's helpful, that's valuable, that drives improvements for customers and stakeholders, but it's very different than disruptive innovation. I'm sure they could have built a mobile app for cab companies, and that would have been incremental innovation, but Uber is the disruptive form of that, right? And so I think oftentimes organizations can fall into the trap of, hey, one, either they believe they're being innovative, but it's just sustaining incremental innovation. It's not big seismic shifts, or they feel like, man, we can't innovate. We're really struggling to innovate, and they might not be giving themselves enough credit because they actually are doing it in some particular areas.
What are some of the effective ways and ineffective ways that you've seen companies try to solve these problems?
Well, I've lived in startups. I've lived in pre-IPO companies. I've lived in publicly traded companies. I've seen lots of different shapes and sizes. I'm not sure anyone has a formula for it. I think part of it is there a sincere effort on the part of senior management to encourage the willingness to try stuff and experiment? There's the whole thing lately about failing fast. I kind of reject that. I'm not interested in failing fast. I want to learn fast, right? I want to make mistakes, learn, and keep going. I'm not really interested in the failing fast part. Pick yourself up and keep moving. And one of the things I've noticed is there's a definite relationship between how long you take to make a decision and your risk tolerance, right? And so if you struggle to make decisions, and it takes you months, well, then your appetite for risk is really low because your perspective is, wow, we spent 3 months trying to decide this. It had better work because we've spent 3 months and the consequences of it, versus we could change our mind tomorrow, and that's okay. And I have a tolerance for that because how much really could change between today and tomorrow? Probably not a whole lot. And so I think that is where, one of the things I've learned in the past few years is Agile is not just a development methodology. It's sort of it's a way of thinking for all the things you do. So if you apply those Agile principles to how you make decisions, how you do things, even on the product management side with my team of direct reports, 9 a.m. most mornings, we do our own stand-up. It's not an engineering stand-up. It's a product management stand-up where we talk about things that we're doing. It's not some novel concept. We're just taking something we know works in the development of what we do and say, well, we should just do that for our own stuff. Be on the same page. Hey, did something come up yesterday? And again, I think that's just habit building. We do it now. We don't really even think about the fact that we do it now because it's part of what we do. It's habit forming. And it allows us to make decisions or make mistakes, vice versa, on a much faster scale, right? And I think the faster we move through ideation, making decisions, moving forward, shipping stuff, I think you get a more tolerance for risk. And risk is typically the enemy of innovation. Well, we can't do that, or if we did that, what bad thing might happen, right? People get risk averse And the more risk averse you get, the less likely you are to innovate, the less likely you are to innovate, the more likely you are to get disrupted. Like, a lot of these things are really predictable, although in most cases they're predictable after it already happens, right? Like, oh, well, what a surprise that Radio Shack went out of business, because who's going to Radio Shack to buy computer parts? Hindsight's 20/20, and hindsight oftentimes seems to know all the answers. But if you knew that, why didn't you say that in advance, right? You're so clever.
During your career at Blackbaud, you led an Idea Lab group for a while. What was that experience like, and what did you learn from it?
It was a great experience, in part because we weren't just thinking about new ideas or things that we could do differently. We were also trying to apply different techniques, different ways of approaching problem solving. So it wasn't just about, hey, let's go off in a room and come up with some really clever ideas, but it was, how can we approach executing some things in some different ways? I think one big takeaway from it was innovation really can't happen in a vacuum or in isolation. Again, you can't say, well, there's just one group, there's a special skunkworks team that's off somewhere putting wings on frogs or doing really out there concepts. You can do that initially, and you'll find some things that work. But if you, again, want to make innovation part of the culture, everyone has to have an element of what they're doing that behaves that way, or you do things that way. And so, one of the things that I sort of learned since then is a lot of the stuff that we're doing on the data and analytics side is applying stuff that we learned and tried in the Idea Lab, but more of like, this is just how we do stuff, right? It's not specific to one particular part. There was nothing overly novel or unique about how we were approaching it. It was more like we decided to do it that way. So I think that was one thing. I don't believe that innovation really works in a bubble or in isolation from other parts of the company. In a startup, that's easy because usually the startup is, it's one or two ideas and you're betting the farm on that. In a larger company or in the corporate world, that's harder to do. And I know people struggle with that. I've worked in startups in the past. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not one of those people who has a mindset that I want to completely own and manage every piece of the puzzle. I'm more of an intrapreneur. I like being inside the belly of the beast and doing interesting stuff and trying to produce value that way. And I'm not as interested in having to control all the pieces of it. And I think part of that goes back to, you can't do things in a vacuum. Right. You've got to do it across the organization. Otherwise, it doesn't scale to get the results you want.
How do you think your role now has been impacted by your experiences and passion for innovation?
I am ultimately a person who likes to solve problems. I like to understand why things work and why they don't work. And so having a bit of that natural curiosity, I think, helps shape some of the things that we're doing. Certainly, Blackbaud has been in the analytics business for quite a while, but we're using some new technologies. Some things have become more mainstream, and our ability to react to that and respond to that is more important than it ever really has been. And I think part of it is because I come to this from a different perspective. I'm not a trained statistician. I understand what a regression analysis is. Don't ask me to do one for you. That I question things. I want to understand how and why does that work that way. But I also know where we have data science people or engineering folks who know infinitely more about how to execute on something than I ever will. But how do I empower them? How do I give them direction? Or in a lot of cases, how do I be very clear about, hey, this is the problem we're trying to solve. Let's focus on that. Or being clear with them in terms of how would we measure, how we create value from something we do. If you give really smart people a problem, their inclination is to want to solve it. One of the things that we always deal with is, as professionals at what we do, we're being asked to solve something with constraints, right? A constraint could be a customer constraint or a budget constraint or a time constraint. And I think one of the things I've learned from over the years of building stuff and things working and sometimes things not working is to be clear with the teams about what those constraints are up front so that they know sort of, what box that they're working in. Kind of reject that whole think outside the box. So you can think outside the box, but eventually there is a box we have to play within. Now, sometimes we're better off thinking, how do we make the box bigger? rather than just pretending it doesn't exist. But we all work with those types of constraints. And so I think what I found over the years is the more I can be clear with data science people, data engineering folks, software engineers, UX designers about the problems we're trying to solve, the constraints we're dealing with, and whenever it feels like we may be straying a bit off course, trying to direct people back to, now remember why we're all doing this. Remember why we're trying to solve this specific problem, is always really important too.
Yeah, there's always boxes. The key is figuring out what are the real boxes versus what are the perceived ones that you shouldn't be in. There's
that. You sometimes get into shadow beliefs, things that you think are true or maybe others think are true, and you need to go find out, well, is that really true? Especially over the years of doing a lot of customer engaged discovery and trying to make sure that you don't have confirmation bias about how something should work or how it should operate. And you need to do a ton of customer interaction and validation. And then sometimes that's challenging because you'll spend time. We've just been working on something in a particular area where we've had a lot of customer involvement through a series of prototyping exercises. And what I've learned is every so many iterations, we need to check back in with some internal folks to sort of show them the progress, because if you go too far, their reaction to it is like, well, why is it that way? And it's like, well, it's that way because this is iteration number 15. We've talked and interviewed and observed 25 people, and like They haven't been there for the journey. They haven't been there for the journey, and it's really hard to bring them along. And so one of the things I found with that is people who aren't direct participants in that process, you do have to check back in with them. You can't get too far down the road, otherwise you can run into sort of internal organ rejection of, are you sure that's it? That can't be it. That seems too obvious. Or are you sure people really wanted that particular feature? Are you sure they really want it to work that way? You've got to check in with folks who may not be engaged in the day-to-day validation of those types of things.
You referenced Clayton Christensen earlier. Who are the thought leaders and mentors or role models that have shaped your perspectives on innovation?
I think it's sort of a mashup. I mean, I read just about anything I can get my hands on, and then I usually then give those physical books to other people. I mean, I read, Marty Kagan, Jeff Patton, a lot of Seth Godin, Mark Hurst. One of the things that I've caught myself recently is if you'd asked me 10 or 15 years ago, would Harvard Business Review be one of the things I spent a lot of time reading and digesting? I said, no way, what do they know? I got a copy sitting in my bag right here, right? So I spend a lot of time in the evenings reading and trying to just stay up to date on stuff and sort of challenging my own thinking, or at least trying to apply what other people are talking about. In recent years, you've had the whole lean startup, Eric Ries phenomenon, and I think there's a lot of merit to that approach, but I always am trying to take that approach and then apply that. I used to drive my professors in graduate school nuts because I was always wanting to apply the theoretical. Yeah, that's great in theory, but how do you actually do that? I feel like when we're doing things, I often feel like we're the applied sciences division. No, we actually want to make the jetpack. We actually do want to make the invisible plane. How would we do that? Not just conceptually. I think in general, this is true of a lot of innovation stuff. Ideas are the easy part. Execution is the hard part. It's all about taking something from an idea, determining its value, prioritizing it, and then execution. I think a lot of folks on the outside think that the idea part is the hard part. No, it's not. Now, what I think you probably have to realize is 90% of your ideas are bad, right? But that's okay, because all you're looking for is that one or two ideas that are just breakthrough and make all the difference. But you have to go through a lot of crap sometimes to get there. And again, I think it goes back to if you're used to that, if you're comfortable with that, and the faster you move, I feel like you get in this flow of, oh, that's okay, it was a bad idea, because we didn't spend 6 months on that bad idea. We spent a half an hour or a day, and you just get more comfortable with it because the pace at which you're moving is quick enough where you accept that every day is iterative, and that's okay. I think the challenge for companies going into the future is sort of what's their tolerance for that, right? Can you move too fast, right? We certainly know you can move too slow. There is probably some speed limits, that you should probably not exceed. You get diminishing returns from going too fast. I just think a lot of times it's that healthy mix. It's not too fast, but it's not too slow. We want the Goldilocks. We want just right. That's what we want to do. Move fast enough to make decisions and drive value, not too fast that we make too many mistakes, and not too slow that we fall behind.
Yeah, I find a lot of these, whether it's lean or agile or customer discovery, a lot of these practices are great and they're wonderful in that they're so easy to digest and there's so much value in them. But the challenge is, okay, now how do I do that at scale? To your point, how do I apply this in this context where there's a lot, more complexity? One of the big challenges I find around innovation in a big company like Blackbaud is, people can buy into these practices from a conceptual level, but actually applying them is much more of an art form within a larger organization, especially if there isn't that structure and buy-in from the top.
I think there's a tendency, I think this is because I spent a lot of years dealing with a lot of process and process improvement, that I definitely buy into the value of process. Not everyone's there. But process is the thing that lets you do it at scale, that knows that you can repeat something over and over. It doesn't mean, I always tell people, when we're doing innovation, we're not baking a cake, right? It's not a recipe. It's not like 2 eggs, milk, sugar, flour, set the oven and you're done. It's not a recipe. There's a process, and you will find over time, some things work for you. I don't care if you call it agile or purple horseshoe or whatever you call it. You probably have some approach that you take over time to what you do, and that you will find things that work and find things that don't. And over time, you should adjust, right? You should find that you don't need to do certain things, or that you really need to do certain things. I think that's the whole point. Years ago, I remember we used to have a sign up that said, if you're not growing, you're dying, right? And so the whole idea of if you're not growing how you think about doing things, if you're not constantly looking to improve, what are we doing here? Yeah. I do think there is certainly value to pick any process, all things being equal, but just know that you're going to find stuff that works better, gets results for you over time, and being willing to change that as you go, versus sort of the tendency for folks, you're bringing a process, that's not how we do things, or, that couldn't possibly work. The danger is folks who want to reject something outright at the very beginning. It's you got to try it first, right? And find where you get into a groove with it.
As a leader at Blackbaud, a company that laid some of the foundation for the growth in Charleston's technology community, what's your perspective on our tech and entrepreneur community here?
I think it's pretty amazing the amount of growth that we've seen in the tech community in Charleston. I've been at Blackbaud just over 13 years now. And when I first came here, you had sort of that initial reticence of, if this doesn't work out, there's not a lot of things to do here. And now that's certainly not the case. There's a lot of technology here. It's drawing people in. I think that's all beneficial. And I've seen other cities struggle with this issue. And I think Charleston, the weather and the geography and other things certainly don't hurt. But I think over time you'll continue to see technology grow here, a lot of great opportunities. And it's just different here. Obviously, Blackbaud has a presence in a lot of other cities in the U.S. and overseas. And you see different dynamics in those cities, where either too much tech or not enough tech. But it's been interesting to watch it grow here in Charleston, and I think it presents a lot of opportunities for people. But I also think there's opportunities for a lot of people working in this field to network and just get to know other people who are working on different types of stuff, right? There are lots of product managers at different companies doing different things, whether they're building airplanes or software or other things here in Charleston. There's probably a great opportunity for more networking, because my guess is there's similar challenges and opportunities that people are dealing with. There's probably a great opportunity there to talk more, and things like Dig South and other events that come in. It create opportunities for people to interact. Wow, you do that too. Wow, you're 2 miles from where I am. That's awesome. So I think it's all really positive. I see no reason why you wouldn't see it to continue to grow in the future.
beyond the individual networking opportunities, what are some other things that you think Blackbaud can do to learn from or leverage the innovation that's going on elsewhere in the community?
I think always having your antenna up and your eyes open and listening and paying attention to what's happening. Obviously, Blackbaud's been in Charleston for quite a while and pretty well established. There's probably an opportunity on our end to facilitate conversations around technology or things that we've learned, but also it's a great opportunity on our end to just observe and watch how different startups or different companies are doing things. I mean, that's one of the things that I've always enjoyed whenever there's a networking event in town or there's an event or something like that, is I'm usually there more to lurk. And so, what are these guys talking about? That's interesting. And to a certain degree, that's refreshing. I mean, I do a lot of speaking out there about things that we're doing with nonprofits and technology. It's great to be in a place where I can sometimes go somewhere and just sit back and watch what other people are talking about and get some interest out of that, which is a good change of pace.
Steve MacLaughlin, Vice President of Data Analytics for Blackbaud. Well, thanks for being on the show, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
I just passed my 14th anniversary at Blackbaud and have seen the company grow and evolve as the Charleston tech community has grown and evolved. They continue to increasingly invest in innovation and establishing themselves as leaders in the social goods space. Check out the website at blackbaud.com to learn more about what they're doing. If you're interested in the topic of innovation, I highly recommend Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma that Steve referenced during the interview. I also suggest going back into our archives here at Silicon Harbor Radio and listening to episode 34 from back in November of 2015 when we featured Gray Somerville and Launchpath Innovation. Gray has presented at the Revolve Conference in Dig South over the past couple of years and has a lot of insight into the challenges companies and individuals face around innovation. Our partners at Silicon Harbor Magazine are a great resource for keeping up with all of the events and news in the Charleston technology, creative, and entrepreneur community. Visit them at siliconharbormag.com and follow them on Twitter at SiliconHBRMAG. You can follow us at TechLifePod and also find us on Facebook. The best way to keep up with the show is to subscribe. For iTunes, visit www.siliconharborradio.com or search for Tech Life with Rich Conte or Silicon Harbor Radio. If you enjoyed the show, let us know by leaving us a rating and a review. Subscribing via RSS is as simple as visiting techlife.libsyn.com/RSS. You can also find episodes of the show at Silicon Harbor Magazine on their podcast page. While you're there, check out their new job board and some of the recent news involving past Silicon Harbor Radio guests, including Launchpeer announcing the launch of Launchpeer Labs, an investment fund and accelerator geared towards idea stage ventures. Booz Allen Hamilton, formerly Spark, opening their new expanded office, which will serve as a digital hub for the company. Fish Labs naming a new CEO, Tony Prince, to succeed former CEO and founder John LaCour, who will move into a new role as CTO. And a recap of the Disrupt HR conference held on May 19th that featured a couple of past guests, Matt Goff of Ecovate and Chad Norman of Catch Talent as speakers. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes over the next couple of weeks featuring design and development studio Fount, the MUSC Innovators Group, and Steve Parker, CEO and founder of Levelwing Media. That's all the time we have on this episode of Silicon Harbor Radio, brought to you by the Tech Life Podcast and Silicon Harbor Magazine. I'm your host, Rich Conte, and thanks for listening.